Hello everyone. In this video, I am going to discuss constraint inheritance and constraint overriding with some examples. Constraint inheritance. Constraints follow the same general rules for inheritance as other class members. A derived class shall inherit all the constraints from its superclass. If I define a derived class, extend class from superclass, so if I define some constraints in the derived as well as the superclass, if I randomize that derived class object, so that randomization method must be obeyed both constraints available in the superclass as well as the derived class. So mean that constraints in the superclass shall be an additional constraint for a derived class. So we'll discuss with some example. So here I'll define one class with a packet name having some random variable as a data of bit type 4 down to 0. Now I'm defining one constraint. The constraint name is data range. The data greater than 0 and data less than 0. In the previous videos I'll explain we should use only single operator here. So data greater than 0 and another data less than 0. I have two expressions. Now I'm deriving one class packet extension extends the packet. So now the derived class also having some random variable of address bit type 4 down to 0. Here I am defining one more constraints in the derived class as a data range, data inside 10 to 15. Means the data should be at the 10 or 11, 12 or 13, 14 or 15, 10 to 15, any value between 10 and 15. Now module constraint inheritance, declaring a handle. So pkt as a packet of packet external initial begin. Now I'm creating instance of packet external type class type. So I'm randomizing this object 3 times by repeat 3 begin packet dot randomize. After each randomization, just I'm displaying data as well as address of that random variable. Now see, in this example, I have a superclass, I have a derived class. That superclass having one random variable and constant data range. Here that derived class also having one random variable and constraint. If randomize this derived class object, now see the output. So data is 2 and address is 15. So now whatever the constraints in the superclass is an additional constraints. Okay. So now the data should be greater than 0 and data less than 10. So that address here 10 to 15. So now data is equal to, because data greater than 0 and less than 10, and data is 3 and data is 6. Whereas here address is in between 10 to 15, 15, 10, 14. Means, so whenever if we define one constraint in the superclass, it is an additional constraint for a derived class. Whenever if we randomize that derived class object. Now here in this video I'll explain what is the difference between the constraint inheritance and constraint overriding. So now if you see any constraint in the derived class that does not have the same name as a constraint in the superclass shall be an additional constraint. So we have a superclass as well as a derived class. Each superclass and derived class have individual constraints like constraint 1 and constraint 2. So with a different name, then that superclass constraint as a additional constraint for derived class. It inherits all constraints from the superclass. So now we'll discuss with some examples. So in this example, I'll define one class with a packet name and one random variable ran bit 4 down to 0, and I'm defining one constraint data range is C1. The expression is data less than 21. Same way, so another constraint, so I'm deriving derived class packet extends package. In that I'm defining one more constraint data range C2, whereas in the superclass data range C1, here data range C2. The data is greater than 9. Now I have two constraints with a different name, one in superclass, another in derived class. So now module constraint inheritance and module in between. So I'm declaring handle pkt. Pkt is of type packet extension. Now initial begin. So I'm creating instance for this packet extension. I'm creating object of that class. Now I'm randomizing 3 times. Repeat 3 begin packet randomize after each randomize I'm trying to print the data value. Now if I see the output for this program, that output is data is equal to 12 in first randomize, second randomization 12, and after third randomization we'll get the 16. What is the constraint here? In the superclass constraint, data less than 21, whereas in the derived class constraint, data greater than 9. So while randomizing this object, derived class object, these two constraints are valid. The randomization, the solver consider these two constraints as a valid constraint. So that data should be between 9 to 21. So whereas in constraint overriding, any constraint in a derived class having the same name as a constraint in its superclass shall replace the inherited constraint of that name. So for example, we have one constraint in superclass, another constraint in the derived class, but both constraints having the same name, same identifier. In that case, it is that superclass constraint replaced with inheritance constraint. See some example here. So now I'm defining a simple class with a packet having one random variable data, bit type 4 down to 0, and I'm defining one constraint data range C1. Data less than 21 is the expression. Now I'm deriving one class. So packet extends the package, and I'm defining one more constraint in the derived class with the same name in superclass constraint. Now see data range C1 and data greater than 15. So these two constraints have the same name, data range C1 and data range C1. Now I'm defining one model constraint inheritance, packet extend pkt. I'm declaring one handle initial begin. I'm creating one object. I'm randomizing 3 times. Repeat 3 begin packet randomize. After each randomization, I'm displaying that random variable. Now if we see the output, now what is the output? Data is equal to 21, data equal to 30, data equal to 22. If first randomization, then data less than 21. So now if the derived class having constraint with the same name, the constraint in the superclass, then it is overriding that superclass constraint. Now the solver consider only this constraint as a valid constraint, it overriding this superclass constraint. So what is the expression actually here? In the derived class, data greater than 15. So the solver, while solving this expression during randomization, will get a value, so greater than 15, 21, 30, 22. So the solver won't consider this constraint because the constraint in the derived class is overriding the constraint in the superclass, because both constraints have the same name. So in this video, I discussed constraint inheritance and constraint overriding with suitable examples. Now in constraint inheritance, if the superclass constraint and derived class constraint have different name, then the superclass constraint acts as additional constraint for derived class object. Whereas in the constraint overriding, if both constraints, the constraint in the superclass as well as the derived class having the same name, then the derived class constraint is overriding the superclass constraints. So it inherited constraint of that name simply. So thank you very much.